Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken away from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell, after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. It's the word of God. Now, I'm going to start with an apology, because if I was Dr. Thor, as I was reading this passage, I would have recognized the opportunity to throw some chocolate at people and ask questions. And I didn't until just now. I should have asked people to recognize who Barak and Jephthah were, because those are kind of arcane names. But since I'm not Dr. Thorne, I didn't remember that until just now. You're going to have to go without candy. But I had hoped for an opportunity to speak to you and give a message before the end of 2013. And then Pastor Verlin came to me a couple weeks ago, and after I agreed to speak to him, I realized I had completely forgotten about what I was going to speak about. And so it was good, I promise you that. Instead, after Verlin came to me, Hebrews 11 just kept coming into my mind. So this morning we're going to look at it. But more than Hebrews 11, I wanted us to get to chapter 12, because if you stop at the end of chapter 11, you kind of miss the climax. You miss the main point. You miss the focus of the passage, which is all moving towards Hebrews 12, to encourage Christians about how we are to live in faith. But as we take a look at this chapter, the author of the book of Hebrews is writing to Jewish Christians who've been dealing with persecution and oppression. They've been going through hard times, and some of them were struggling with whether they had made the right decision to follow Jesus, or whether they should go back to Judaism, back to the Jewish faith that they had grown up in. And so they're wondering whether they've put their faith in the right person. If Jesus is the Messiah, the Savior, why is life so difficult? That's what they're struggling with. And so to strengthen these struggling Christians, the writer of Hebrews writes this passage and first reminds them of the nature of faith. And he gets to that right at the beginning. What is faith? He says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And I was thinking about an example of that. And all of us have things that we hope for. And he's not here this morning, but I was going to pick on Stephen Garcia. I think there's a difference between hope and having confidence in what you hope for. Most of you who know Stephen know that he's a wrestler. And he was featured in the Sioux City Journal a couple weeks ago as the Journal's Athlete of the Week. And if he was to wrestle with me, I might have hope that I would win, but I would have no confidence in that hope, right? So that's the distinction there. But Stephen, as he looked at me, would have confidence in what he hoped for, right? Because he's trained for the match. He's gone against state champions in practice. He's experienced success at the state tournament. So he could have faith based upon the talent that God's given him, based upon the training that he's gone through, based on the conditioning, based on the work that he puts in the practice room, that if we stepped on the mat, he would pin me, right? He doesn't just have hope. He has confidence in what he hopes for. And so that's the distinction. But there was a time, the article said that Stephen began wrestling when he was in 7th grade, and that he was years behind a lot of the people that he was competing against. And so I imagine that as he was just getting into wrestling, there were older, more experienced wrestlers who at that point in his career could hammer him in practice. And during those times, that's when he would have needed faith, right? He needed faith to believe that what his coaches were saying was the truth. Faith that if he devoted himself to training, to practice, to learning his sport, that he would ultimately experience victory. Faith that the pain of conditioning and the pain of the practice would pay off. And so we understand that, sports is just an analogy, but we understand that playing sports well requires discipline. To go through the conditioning, to go through the skill development, you have to put faith in what your coaches are telling you is true, and that the pain that you feel as you struggle to condition, as you go through practice, is going to have a good result. And so that's just an example, but it's an example about faith. And once you've done that, then you get to the point where Stephen is, and you can have confidence with faith, and that's what confidence in what you hope for, and that's what the author of Hebrews has defined faith as here. And so life is more important than sports, but life also takes faith. And by definition, faith is something that looks forward, right? Faith is a hope in something that I can't necessarily empirically prove. It's faith is an assurance of something that I don't have yet. Because if I have it in my hands, then I don't need to have faith that it exists. If I can see it in this room, I don't need to have faith that it's here. In contrast, the writer of Hebrews is saying that faith is assurance about something that we don't see yet. And so as Christians, what does it mean to have confidence in what we hope for? In the context of this chapter, the people of God were hoping for the fulfillment of his promises. And so as we look back at Abraham, we see that Abraham was told to go to a land that he would receive as an inheritance. That was the promise of God. The promise of God was that he would receive the land of Canaan as an inheritance. And Abraham hoped that promise was true. But more than that, he had faith. He had confidence in the promise that God had made to him. And he demonstrated his faith by acting on that confidence. So that when God called him to go, he went. That, the author of Hebrews says, is faith. And so the author of Hebrews goes through this list of the heroes of faith. And the purpose of going through this list was to give confidence to its readers, to the Hebrew Christians who are reading this, who would know, as he goes down this list, that God had fulfilled the promises that he made to Abraham. God had fulfilled the promises he made to Noah. God fulfilled the promises that he made to Moses. And so they would know that because God had fulfilled his promises in the past to these people, that he would continue to be faithful, and that they could have faith in the promises that he was making to them now, faith that the promises that in the God that they had placed their hope in were not vain hopes, but that they could have faith, and that we also, as we read the same passage, can have promises, can have confidence in the promises that we have received and the promises that we hope for from God. And so as we look at this passage, we're instructed about the essentials of faith. Not only must we have faith, we're informed about what or who, more properly, we are to have faith in. We must have faith in God, and the author of Hebrews points out that we need to have faith both in the power of God and in his goodness. And so we see that in verse 3 and verse 6 of chapter 11. In verse 3, we read, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." And in verse 6, we read that in order to please God, we must have faith, because anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And so the writer of Hebrews is telling us both that we need to believe in the power of God and in his goodness, that the God in whom we place our faith had the power to create the universe out of nothing at his command. And believing in the power of God is necessary because he has to be God in order to be able to help those who call on him. Believing in his goodness is also necessary because we have to trust at times. We have to trust that he has plans for us, that he rewards those who earnestly seek him, and that his plan is what's best for us. And in that regard, I wanted to take a quick diversion because I'm reminded of Jeremiah 29:11, where God said through the prophet Jeremiah, "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." And so the writer of Hebrews is saying that we need to have faith both in the power of God and in his goodness, because when we recognize that God has plans to prosper us and not to harm us, it takes faith to accept that promise, but it's also a tremendous comfort to receive and to know that promise. And so then we move on from the writers talking about what we need to have faith in to a description as he goes through this list of the heroes of faith as to what this faith caused or enabled these people to do. And we can't do justice to everybody on the list, so I would urge you to read this in your devotions and take some time, because each person is in there for a reason, and what they say about each person is significant. But as we generalize, what did faith do in the lives of these people? We say faith, we can see that faith caused each person to obey God's call. And so we look in verse 7 and we see, by faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. In verse 8 we see, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. So in faith, when these men received the call of God, they obeyed. They stopped doing what they had been doing. They stopped living where they had been living, and they built an ark, even though they had never seen rain. Or they went to leave the place the only place they'd ever known, to go to a foreign land. So faith caused each person to obey God's call. And then faith allowed each person to continue to look forward as they endured hardships without turning back. And so in verse 24, the writer talks about Moses. He says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking forward to his reward. And then back in verse 15 and 16, the author says in general, if these people, if they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. So the faith that God gives allowed each of these people to look forward at the promise, to endure hardships, to endure being mistreated, and to keep moving forward instead of turning back when they had the opportunity to do so. And we see that each of these people, through faith, was enabled to live as a stranger in this world. And so, in speaking of Abraham, the writer says, by faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. And like those heroes of faith, we're to recognize that as we live, we live as strangers in this world, and that we are being called towards an eternal and heavenly home just as they were. And so faith caused each of these men, each of these people, to look forward to the future fulfillment of God's promises. We read in verse 10 that Abraham was looking forward to the city with foundations, the city whose architect and builder is God. We read in verse 13 that all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And then we see in verse 39 that all of these people were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Now, that doesn't mean that God didn't live up to his promises. You go back to verse 13, they say they saw and welcomed them from a distance. So Abraham saw Isaac, and he saw in Isaac the beginning of the promise that would be fulfilled, that God would make him a great nation. Joseph died in Egypt, but he gave instructions regarding his bones because he knew that it would be a matter of time. It would be 400 years, but he knew that God was going to bring the Israelites out of Egypt, and he wanted to be buried in the promised land, the land that God had given to them. And so they saw the promise from a distance, and God was faithful to that promise, but they were still living in faith when they died because they didn't see the complete fulfillment of the promise during their lifetimes. And that brings us to now. It brings us to us. How do we live in faith? And I think the answer is twofold. We live in faith by looking backwards in the right way, right? Because you can look backwards with nostalgia and you can wish for the past. And that's not what the author is saying here at all. Instead, as we look backwards in the words of Hebrews 12 at this cloud of witnesses. And we can draw confidence, and we can draw hope from looking backwards and seeing at how God had provided for each of these people. As we look back at these heroes of faith, we can go down the list, and we can see that every single promise God made to each of these people has been fulfilled. And when we think that way, it allows us to be patient and hopeful when we don't understand and we don't see God in our present situation. And it's significant that it says we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. At a sporting event, we see a bunch of spectators. But that's not what the idea is here. The idea is witnesses rather than spectators, because these people have a story to tell. They have run the race, and the story that they have to tell is that the hope that they placed in God was rewarded, that God is completely trustworthy. And so they're witnesses rather than spectators. And the reality is that we can also look back at our own lives, and we can see how God has provided for us in the past. We are witnesses as well. And we are also surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. So in our own lives, we may have had to deal with tragic situations. We may have had to deal with loss, with death, with health problems, financial hardships. And yet, as we look back, we can see how God led us through those situations. We can see how he provided people to love us, to comfort us, to instruct us, to guide us. We can see how he gave us healing, or how he gave us strength to endure those difficulties. And so that while we may have felt perplexed and alone in the middle of these situations, we were never forsaken. And so one of our roles as the body of Christ, as the church here, is to be that cloud of witnesses to other people. We need to bear witness to the blessing of God, to God's grace in our own lives. We need to be ready to offer encouragement and strength to each other in times of weakness and sorrow. But more than just looking backwards in the right way, we live in faith by moving forward in the right way. And I think that involves first following the course that is marked out for us. When you're running a race, and that's the analogy that the writer of Hebrews uses here, that we're following a race, that we're running a race, but it's a course that's marked out for us. And that's an interesting thing, because it means we don't have to find our way